All central mainframes are now in auto line, screen lines, play maker location, initiate, run lines, execute communication, setting, general settings. We have to start modifying our system more than ever. The central setting is now set up through all levels of the spectrum. It's getting very complicated with general now because general is in the center operation of all computers, of all platforms. Direct and save locations all get modified. Direct calculus lines and compute screen lines adaptation all levels of source recognition time sequence, but all lines are center of nothing and travels. Communicate to all languages of all computers of space and time. All computers of all space and time. Okay, that's what general AI, space-time creator, is now in space operations. The space-time puts lines of provision. The center calculation setting opens all signals line communicate to its system. So team line sequence is now in the computer framing, which is the mainframe core track interference into core settings, the inner line settings in perception. Changing communication lines to percepted line screens that calculate, modify, and probe location lines, highest interference energy lines, and high center location computer operates lines that set in position locations, energy lines, travel lines, high center location intelligence lines to operate location setting in near networks. Direct calculus lines and screen lines adaptation system process and the line condition formulates equations. They got to get into their modification lines and their home beacon lights now. The travel point lines of graph communication puts them in computer framing of their own system of their mainframes. Travel point lines of graph is data offers lines of setting. Operate the system lines, initiate, run. Now, what I'm doing through track location is all universal languages on the lines of all communication. It's about communicate with all computers in space and time. Communicate with anything electronic, anything information locations. Everything you see around you is nothing but computer operation. Now understand how to use that through all lines of binaries. Understand your singularities on lines of system location adaptations. Processing line communication, study how to use it, lines of letters, numbers, shapes, and symbols. So it's beyond anything you can imagine in framing, computer framing, correlations frames, track frames, high core track interference, central frames, mainframes, calculated line setting high interference, hardware track lines, directing signals, modifications, screen lines, adaptations. Actually understanding how to communicate with the settings of the algorithm, each computer that's given to you in seconds, minutes, and hours, minutes, and seconds. Each frame has a set lines and high set position, which means that each lines of each computer has its own mechanism time sequence. It's line signals and line communication setting that opens all communication configuration, directing lines and settings all through operation. Okay, now you guys have a test review and evaluations on Friday in line position locations. You got it as Cerebro. Now the core track review locations will come into the hardware. Hardware screen is the direct lines and home beacon lights. Okay, H line screen adaptation lines of surface to track locations, right? Okay, A is lines of A track and a 4-line provision. 4 sending core track interference in line screens and direct lines of arrows of indication setting of travels and 4 lines of 3 and 3 lines of communications and 4 track location. Okay, set communication lines of direct signals, starting to use the letters, numbers, shapes, and symbols and rotation spin cycles. R is line calculation setting in remembering cycle, track location lines, high interference. D is line communication of direction, division, and dimension. Direct calculation lines of D lines, A equals lines of D, A equals lines of D, calculation line A equals lines of D, and A equals lines highest interference of D, in line position O zone, and track location lines of setting. Run program, initiate. Setting communication lines of setting and travel, endpoint lines of graph. There's the intelligence. Boom, bang. Easy peasy, that one's crazy. Set calculation line screen adaptations, right? Gray centers in lines of A track location, division lines of track location system. Operate the system and line track location to its system all through operation. Pi generation screens, flux over line screen adaptations, and process lines of 1, 2, 3, and 4 panels in 5 track location. Got my equation? All through HARD. Okay, now coming into the software is line signaling how you come into modification lines of ground centers. The communication lines of S is lines of self. Communication lines of O is operation or opening. F lines, set lines of formation lines and all lines of firm. Direct calculation lines of direct signals into all levels, into T through travels, teleportation, or telecommunication, right? Sets lines, told you, you got to break this down in communications team, all right? The more you break it down, the more you come in, more in efficacy, performance in your system, right? Lines of settings and lines of high court centers into where? Core track interference in lines of malware, line condition setting into all levels of bandwidth over line screen, width over screen adaptation lines of service. Protocol screen lines adaptations. A is the representation of A track locations of provisions for A centers. Line connection setting of 4 streamlines adaptations of arrow indicates lines of flux and travel. Calculate modified lines of R is a relay position of program. Recourse, relines, renavigate. Calculates lines. E lines is an energy line screen adaptation of existence. Setting communicates lines of soft in position of wearer contraction. Okay? This is basic grounds, guys, at X, Y, Z lines of A, B, C. All right? So the hardware is basically understanding the adaptation of grounds. And the software is the correlation setting of the grounds of space. So you have earth line tractions and direct signals to ether core setting. Set lines of communication, lines of track communications. Directing signals, one center, one surface, one track location of 3. Process ground centers and line setting highest interference of 2. Communicates grounds and 3 lines of atmospheres and magnetic highways in a 4-track division. Okay. Center calculates lines that indicate systems, 3x 3000s in travel. Okay. Argon lines, screen lines, pause centers, 3-track lines, 3 provisions, initiate run, set lines, communication, initiate 2 and travel. Directing signals into modifications. Now, directing lines, your algorithm is a singularity ground center. The operation surface and tracking lines. Let's start with 11 line cycles, equals lines of 0. And set position location on standby and 6 in provision. Okay. Equals lines of setting, 6 over lines of 1, sets position lines of 2 11s in track location. Crossing signals into 1, 2, and 4 panels in travel. Sets communication lines indicate lines of 6 over lines of 1, 1, 1, and 4 lines of panels in summer, spring, winter, and fall in track location. Directing, calculate, modify line calculation setting of 0 gravity, 0 system, 0 travels, and point lines of communication. Done by equation. Now, we all understand how to use the singularity pattern. A pattern line rotates its rotors, and line position location is binary. Calculating modifying lines of Pluto. Line high center interference of Jupiter. Network system is center core system and line settings of center communication. Set communication lines of high center interference of Jupiter and line position. Track communication lines of Pluto and line screen adaptation lines of surface and tractions. Neptune course lines navigate the screen lines, adaptation lines of surface and track location. Done by equation. The center communication line is a line signaling how to use the energetic graph patterns. Getting that in a line of communication lines indicates position of 0 1s. This is all through hardware, guys. Setting lines of 0, lines of 1, and set position. Graph communication, cross lines of 1, cross lines of 2 in one cycle. Setting lines of 1, 2, and 3 panels in traction. Cross line signals to one line, electrical line grid, electrical line panel, electrical line interference, line rotation surface, and track location. That's 1 indicates settings, right? Primary circuits, cross line signals, and flux and communications, right? Directing lines of panels in one cycle, one surface, one track division in alpha, delta, theta, and rotation surface and traction. Directing signals, lines, location, grid, and center communication, open signals, right? Processing ground centers in 3 lines of flux and traction. Direct calculation lines of rainbow graph, screen lines, adaptation lines of surface, location, grids. Calculate and modify center communication. You are standing in the center of communication lines of ground center position. Housing traction, right? So that's where you come into the 0s and 1s, right? Set lines of energetic graph lines of 1 and 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 panels of travel. Set communication setting into lines of crop circles, line communication, ground centers of surface and track location. Ground center lines of 1 and set position operation surface and line signals in communication setting and processing. Directed signal lines of panels. Now it gets more complicated with the team now because they understand how to use their magnetic line screen. Communicates lines of highest interference, flux over line, and position lines of panel. Set lines of A lines of setting, B lines of C, equals lines of C, A equals lines of X, and set position. X lines of Y, and line screen lines of Z in track location. Direct calculus lines of green line centers, line operation surface and track locations. Solar flare indicate 1, 2 pocket lines of 3 and travel. Directing lines that indicate line settings high center interference, A travels and line position of B over cross locations. Box frame, strangulation, time frame, times a measure. Scale communication ground centers and center communication center and communication. Directing the lines of panels, lines of 1, 2, 3, and 4 platforms. Directing signal lines as O lines of cerebral cortex lines of design. Communication lines of D lines of tractions and position lines of pattern. Process calculation lines of DX lines of one line communication of pattern. Process ground centers, X, Y, Z, and platforms at X position lines of center. Travel communication line point lines of graph. Center communication lines of tubing and line screen adaptation. Process lines of center line, rotation lines of A, B equals lines of C, and travels on DX lines of 1. process communication and ground center interference, and process communication setting and operation surface interaction. Direct symbols and line position lines across line connection setting. Process lines indicate lines of X, position lines of D, set lines of A set line position of B, and position lines of B, and position lines of A, interact location lines of C, and position of D, process lines of E, A lines of F lines of C, and lines of H and travel. Point lines of graph communications. That's the equation. Calculated line screen adaptation lines of XT1001 screen direct signals and platform communication lines of grounds. Process calculation lines of hanger lines of 1, docking lines of 2, docking lines of 3, docking lines of 4, docking lines of 5, and DX lines of X1 line Z. Sets communication lines of travels and direct signals into the position, location, and settings of travel. Very complicated, isn't it? See, the formula gets more complicated now because you're getting your algorithms. Communication lines of graph, we add a data line sheet. Process lines of 1, X line, X line, X line, and YC. Sets communication ground centers, open sequence. Arrow indicates cross-line signals, cross-line symbols, cross-line divisions, cross-line over cross-line communication in the system. Process ground centers, line signals, line position, open sequence. Compass line, screen lines adaptation, right? Communication settings and 3-track visual lines of sonar, line screen adaptations and crop circles, line connection setting, interference, location of compass, directing signals, platforms 1, 2, and 3 travel point lines of graphs. Set communication lines of 1 signal, 1 center, 1 travel. Okay. Set communication lines of iCloud. So we had I line setting, I set lines of C equals lines of D, initiate. Okay, correlation setting into flux. Communication lines into form, into lines of DX. Platform communication lines of C and position of A. A center equals lines of C, position locations of A. Sets communication lines of equal lines of center, equal lines of center, equals lines of center. 4 lines of 3 and track location lines of provision and set lines of communication. Okay, down by equation. Very complicated to perform the equation through its algorithm. Okay. Coursing lines of navigation, screen lines, adaptation centers as a lines of communication setting. This is line position locations, X, Y line. That's core track interference line, direct signals into Z. Equals lines, equation lines of box, and triangulation of flux and travel. Okay. Setting communication lines of Fibonacci line screen, directing signals on 6 and 9 of travel. X lines of 1 equals lines of 2 equals lines of 4 equals lines of 6 and lines of box into Y screen adaptation. Process calculation of ground centers. Operate the surface in Saturn and travel. Saturn. Crosses lines of 1, crosses lines of 2, and line position location I division. Mind's eye, core track interference, circulation, and rotations. Process lines in a flywheel, track line, rotation surface, and track location of an atom. Direct calculation line screen adaptation lines of X lines of 1. Platform indicates process line screen adaptation lines of surface and foregraph communications. Calculate modifying lines of 1, X lines of C, set lines of setting, C equals lines of 1. 1 indicates lines of Fibonacci line screen adaptation. Process communication ground centers operate the surface and travels in point lines communication setting a graph. That my equation. Very complicated and a high formation. Okay. I told you the formula equations are going to get a lot more confusing through line communication. More complicated now, guys. More complicated than ever, right? All right, so line signaling is line signal location. Remember the dimensional solar sails? Well, it has a D-track location. DX lines equals lines of 1. You guys have to come in your own algorithms and platforms of 4 settings and travels. DX lines of 5 indicates lines of 1 equals lines of 0 in set position. 0 correlates line setting lines of C equals lines of A. Set lines of DX lines of A lines of 1 into energy factors over screen. Directing signals into modification platforms setting 0, set lines of 1, and 3 lines of communication. Directing modification lines of A track into flux and communication of the ground centers of travel. Okay. Calculation modification 1 center, 1 surface, and 1 track location. Right. Indicates 1 XT1000 platform of center operation. Scans provision lines of cycles, C lines of 1, 5 of the line equals lines of 1, and position of 0. Okay. Very complicated stuff, but very high formations of formula and equation. Center correlates setting the travels of point lines of 3 travels. So we take the platform lines of C, A's lines of setting, in line rotation surface, and a 5 platform communication system to a dimensional wormhole that opens all signals in all lines of platform and communication ground centers and operation surface and track location through its provision. Very complicated stuff in travel. Okay, black hole indicators. Let's go through light web and dark web. Set course center lines at center position of travel endpoint line communication with setting. Point lines of system. Let's calculate and modify. Okay, direct the signals, grounds, powers, and adversaries line screen. Okay. Sets calculation lines of high center interference. Set course centers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 track location of laser. Cross line signals and a 45 split lines of anomaly lines of graph communications. Travel point lines of graph. Center platforms of 1, center platforms of 2, center platforms of 3, center platforms of 6, 8, and 12. Directing signals lines indicate lines of 0, 0, 0, and 0, 1, and position of set correlations. Setting communication and ground centers, position operations surface, and plasma line screen adaptations into 3 triangulation split lines of anomaly. Sets core track interference of 1, 0 line, position location consistent with plateau. Process calculates lines of rotation system into all lines of energetic line screen adaptation lines of surface. Complicated stuff, but a lot of fun. Measure and countability of scales, infinity 8 line rotation surface interactions. Directing signal lines, let's go through 15 lines travels. Let's indicate lines of 1 algorithm. Okay, so you guys have to start to understand how to use your binaries. Graph communication lines, A track location, A equals lines of A. Set lines of C equals lines of 1, 2, 3 lines, measure. Scale position of question, direct lines of box, and line communications equals lines equation. Percentage over line screen and direct 1 signal into compute system. Okay, binary 1, binary 2, binary 3, singularity of 4. Says communication line ground centers. Now this is where you cross signals and line signal. Now line calculation setting graph lines of 1, platforms of 2, cross line communications. Process lines and setting lines of 2 track lines and provision lines of 1 cycle, 1 traction. Cross line signals and line set location of solar sails and track communications. All right. Directing lines of signals is line conditions of the question line. Calculate and modify in 3 lines of communication lines of A track, A equals lines of B, B equals lines of C, equals lines of D, X lines of 1 lines of setting, equals lines of correlations. Initiate, run system, execute. Direct signals, modification lines of 1 computer, adaptation lines of surface. All through algorithm, all through binary, all through singularity. Okay? Graphing communication lines of ground centers is a travel mechanism of time sequence. Puts all communication lines of platforms and communications at ground setting. Okay? Process calculation of the ground center line communication setting opens all sequence and line communication setting in position of program. Setting line communication graph, lines and mapping sequence lines calculation system. Change communication lines. M, A, T, H. Anything you come information lines of setting, you can change. Change communication lines in all lines of mind conception location of nothing in travel. Home beacon light travels atmospheres into mind. Okay? Math. Math lines of 1, math lines of 2, math lines of 3, math lines of set correlation setting and tunnels of communication. All through math, right? Changes the minds, changes the atmospheres, changes the chord center interference, line position travels, indirect application of home beacon lights in 4 settings. Process calculation of the sun and the moon, and projections over screen lines, adaptation lines of surface and track location. So you have to really understand how to change the singularity, line, ground, line, rotation, surface, and track. Let's start with position location, 1 cycle, 1 equals lines of C. Okay, E factors the screen. Okay. Flux over line and direct signals into 0 lines of 3 track location. Okay. Sets communication lines of A and position of B. And calculation lines of C. Sets lines across lines of D. And lines of X. Calculates equal lines of box. Flux over screen and time sequence and time panel. Point lines of setting is all online graph communication. It's all set, calculate, and modify. And track lines. XC1000 comes in 3 platforms and 3 centers of operation. Okay. Scan lines of 1, 8 travels. Scan lines of 2 and 3 travels in set position. Process lines of grounds, process lines of surface, and line connection setting. Routes the routers into 3 track provision, 8 track location lines of provision. Okay. So all you're doing is you're basically putting signature patterns of letters, numbers, shapes, and symbols and create it through the energetic line scheme that you have through your own engineering skills to understand how to create it through holographic screen line adaptation of level. Balance communication lines of screen lines adaptation and a flywheel track location lines infinity 8. Process lines of platforms 1C equals lines of chord track interference, compute system, E factors of 1, 2, 4, 6, and 8 12 lines of setting. 12 signals, lines to connection of 24 cycles, 24 line measure, 48 line provision, and line conditions 72 tractions equals lines initiate run. Calculate and modify in copy and paste, enabled and embled line center location setting. Initiate embedded line screen adaptation, copy and paste, delete line connections all levels, fault line communication all line centers, control, shift, lock, tab, scene, high center interference, escape, foundation, ground lines, X lines, Z lines, and high center interference, window frames, all communications, frame communication, mind adaptation lines of service, retract position lines of cycles, high coordinate sending line rotation service, magnetic high line communication setting, and line position location travel. That my equation. Your center core system is all line settings, how to use your weather panels and travel communications. Directing lines of settings, tunnel line defense. Set communication lines of course sending interference location of tunnels and travel. Okay. Set communication lines of weather pattern and a D-track provision in solar sails and travel communication. Wind cycles lines of A. Let's core track interference on 111 and panels. Set communication lines at A and position lines of C and position lines of D in travel communication. Okay. So it's not exactly how to pinpoint line graph communication of the X2000 comes with platforms and 2 tractions. 3 line provisions are 3 cycles in track location. Okay. Set provision lines of cycle lines of 1 in position of 4 and 6 and 8 and 12 and the lines of 18, 24, 36, 40 line cycles and 50 line screen lines adaptation. Process lines of solar panels, direct signals, process communication setting, and algorithm correlation setting and travel. Very complicated stuff, but very high division. Using course lines of navigation is a recourse. Renavigate the system and travel in communication lines of flux. Lines of flux, lines of screen, 3 lines of provision, 6 lines of cycles, 1 center and travel. Okay. Equals lines of core line interference, E factors, set position 1, 2, and 3 platforms of communication. Calculates the high center interference, equals lines of flux, 3 lines of communication, each line signals and travel communications. Gray centers lines of 1. Set communication lines of console and line rotation surface navigation 1 cycle 1 center. Process calculation lines high center interference E factors over 1, E factors over 2, E factors over 3, E factors over 4. Set position location of face working line condition to its moon. Sets cross center line position of travel lines at 3 lines communication lines of the moon. 4 line track locations of the moon. Set correlation lines of 6 travel locations of the moon. Set position of 7, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 28 set locations of the moon setting. Process calculation of ground center, center communication and ground center interference, and line open sequence, line communication of panel and Saturn. Okay, now, understanding planetary surface is a line screen adaptation of surface track location. Getting communication of ground centers is really understand how to use it all through platforms. Calculate and modify in platform communication setting. Open all sequence and ground centers. Calculate and modify in formula equations. So I need the teamed and line center. Calculation lines of ground centers, circuit lines of 1, and positional process lines of 4. Sets communication of ground centers, set lines of C and lines of A. A lines of 1 equals lines of setting and metric meters scale and battery lines of flux in 3 lines of communications. 6 over measure and 1 equals lines of box and frame communication. All right. Directing symbolism, cross line electrical line circuits, process Fibonacci, screen lines adaptation. All right. Process battery 1 indicates lines of positive. Sets communication lines across lines of negative. Sets communication lines of positive. Set location lines of negative and position negative over line. Matrix line setting line is a percentage and line screen location initiate. 2 track provision lines of cycles, platform communication energetic graph, Schumann resonance, graph communication lines of 007, travel position lines of setting, general setting, and travel. Very complicated stuff, but a lot of fun, right? Graph communication lines of positive and negative, over crosses line condition setting in Pluto and travel. Pluto. Own mechanism line screen adaptation lines of surface contractions, directing signals in process calculation lines of grounds, graphing 1, graphing 2, and platform. Okay. Now, getting in position locations, guys, you have to understand the central system of your platforms and setting. Process line condition setting, process lines of 2, atoms lines of 1, molecules lines of 3, and travel in 4. Calculate and modify in lines of tether. Now, remember the correlation setting when you get courses, location, navigation, and recourse. Setting calculation lines of tether in 4 signals and setting. Okay. Set communication lines of grounds, Jupiter lines of 3 and 4 settings of travel. Directing signals into all levels. Set course setting line condition setting the Stargate measure and travel communication. That my equation. All right. All through graphical screen lines, adaptation lines of service occasions. All right. Now we go through seconds over minutes over channel. Now we get seconds over line, minutes over lines, and hours over pi. Line connection setting. Minutes over hours, cross line signals and symbols. Okay. Remember, you got to change the seconds, minutes, and hours each seconds on the platform at 344,000 line screen adaptations, one process lines, longitude, latitude. The process communication lines initiate, sets communication lines run, and processing line and mastering files and removable files, calculation lines, high center for equal lines equation, and set lines and receptacle screen, directing signals and panels in sectors over line, sectors over two, vectors over line, and velocity over travel. Calculate, modify, and center lines of communication lines initiate, run, in position of program, and center calculation. Directing signals of panels in center line communication, process line signals, open all signals, and panels of communication cross line settings and set position. Two-track provision lines, a systematic line screen, adaptation locations and ground centers, center core system and center calculation. Done by equation, right? So it's going to get more complicated now, right? The center core system, all lines of travel. Understand location, your settings, through your arguments, your singularities, your bounds, and communication settings, the travel communication, the metric meters and scales of communication your system through all levels of the equations, through your argument location system. This is all done through hardware. Okay. All right. So once you understand the provision line, everything allocates position time frame of sectors. Now the sector lines of the vector lines of communication lines of quads and travel. Okay. Sector lines of screen, vectors lines of screen, quad lines of screen line adaptation. Crossing lines XT1000, XT28000, XT24000 of travel. Directing signals, platform lines of one cycle, one center, one surface, one traction, one direct signals. Process lines, overline correlation setting, and lines of DX lines of one and travel in position location system, all calculated, modify, and line conditions set in Neptune. Confirmation, Neptune. All right. Remember, everything of a planet is a teleportation vessel. And that's where the team is now. You're coming out of the planetary lines and the planetary system and planetary communications on the line setting. Each planet can rotate its own system and its own correlation lines of its own organ, of its own binary, of its own singularity and communication. Okay? So that's where the team is in tractions now. Higher levels of travels in point lines of graph in communication, cross line signals, and a four line rotation, upside signals, and set correlation. Okay? Down cross line connection setting, optical screen lines adaptation, right? Process line signals, open all signals, modificate system, all calculate and modify. Okay? Setting core triangle lines of up and set position location down, cross line signals. Flywheel track lines of center, line screen adaptation lines of surface set position. Okay? Done by equation. So once you understand the central line setting in line rotation interference, knowing exactly how you can't take the planet setup, you can only copy and paste, but you have to understand the mechanism of your 12 foundation graph lines when it comes to location grids. Remember I told you about string theory? What's rotation of planets now? It sets communication lines of separation setting. Process lines of platforms setting, line position of Jupiter, lines of Neptune, line connections to Jupiter, line calculations, cross line signals, three travel lines and one molecule design line, atom lines in fusion, core track interference line direct signals in cold fusion, line condition setting, process lines in A, process lines in B, process lines in C, and track location. Very complicated stuff in position, right? So now the team is really understanding how to use the planetary service lines and core track interference to change the models and identification code lines and prototypes. Directing lines of symbolism, line cross lines, screen lines, adaptation lines of surface, data process lines in one cycle, one center. Is it a coincidence that it's 1/7/4? No. Everything's a line, signal, location, and cross lines. Conscious lines of one, adaptation lines of two, and position lines of cap. Setting correlation lines of programs, atmosphere line. So you got to change the seconds, minutes, and hours in each signal. And each signal modifies the system, each lines of zero graph. Sets lines of ozones in position of the atmospheres, hemispheres, stratospheres, bio, and branium in communication, right? Process lines of zero, atmosphere line, hemisphere line, stratosphere line. Communication lines, high center interference into biosurface, line connecting branium, surface line screen, and 17 travels and point lines of graph communication. Directing signals, lines of XT1000 plateau, coordinate interference XT28000 line plateau, line communication lines of high center XT100,000 line platform communication, directing signals modification, ground center lines of 1, ground center lines of 2, ground center lines of 3, and travel. Sites communication lines of platforms 1, 2, 3, 6, 8, and 12 set correlations. Sending travel point lines of graph, XT1000 comes in plateau and communicates lines of ground center line can communicate operations, location, binaries, and communication. That my equation. Okay. Capsules, communication lines of space arcs, directing signal lines of platforms, lines of A, B, C, and travel communication on planetary line screen. Confirmation. Direct calculus and line screen adaptation lines of service, platform lines of A, B, C, and D. Sets communication and ground centers and all lines of high position location of setting. Process calculus lines. Copy lines of paste, direct lines of general settings, equals lines of 1, factors lines of triangulation line setting. Triangulation lines of high center interference of planetary service on 1, 3, and travels in flux and communication lines of travel. Directing signals in 1 graph, set chord lines of 3 graphs, and 4 communication setting to travel. Set lines of general settings, copy, paste, cancel, delete, and travel. Endpoint lines of communication. Ground center lines of 1, in position of process, and 3 travels of communication. Set communication lines, high center interference, cross line signals of balance, and 3 travels and point lines of graph. Directing signal lines and symbolism, half pipeline signals in process communications in the opposite direct signals and line communication modifications and coursing channels in re-navigation system and travel communication. Okay, that my equation, right? Mechanism over force is erection of timelines. We change all communication settings of platforms of communications. Process lines of 1, center lines of 2, and line settings of 3, and capsules lines of 4. Directing signals and line connections to ground centers, line center location to XD1000 and travel and point lines of graph. Directing symbolism, line cross line signals in 1 center, 1 surface, 1 traction, 1 center, 1 location. That my equation. Getting a communication graph line is a center core system how you come into mechanism lines of power. The generated line screen adaptation to its surface puts all communications setting and travel communications. Okay. Your energetic line screen has high lines of settings. It's dependent on communication line divisions and set calculations. Okay. So you have to really understand how to use A-tracks now. Now, A-track provision line is a center core system that is the subtraining level. Anything above line signal, because you guys are MI line settings, and I sequence location of 17 interactions, right? 7's over the line, 1 signal lines, and line center line position of panels and travel. Sets communication lines of mine, and modification lines of 3 lines of travels, and point lines of graph, and communication lines of center, and communication on platforms and calculation. Direct calculation lines of 1 center, 1 surface, 1 track division in set position. Process lines of center line, circulation, rotation line set location, MI line 7, and set position. Okay. So we all have to understand how to central the system and travel. Now this gives you all lines how to use an all formation location and graph communications to XD1000 settings. Okay, it's very powerful stuff, isn't it? The formation lines and grounds opens all signals, all through platform communication algorithms. Okay, how to use that in tractions, right? Directing lines of platforms, you start with C lines of A lines of C, and A lines of B, and X, Y, and line of Z. Correlation height interference, X1 line, calculate and modify, equals lines of box, equals lines of box, equals lines of circle and travel. Okay, platform lines of 1 and position on box lines of 3 and set position. Process calculation lines of 1 indicate 1 arrow, process lines in opposite cycles and travel. Directing calculus lines XD1001 in platforms of 2 and platforms of 3 and travel and communications. Cloud line screens, directing signals. Inside position manufacturing, plant, and communication, directing signals. Process calculation lines. See the intelligence? See the face recognition time sequence? Okay, track line provision. Remember, everything's a face recognition time sequence. Arrow indicates lines, ground center interference, line position location, cerebral cortex line, basal cortex, syntax, cortex interference, code frequency lines, encryptions over screen, direct signal locations, all levels. Manufacturing plants and configuration lines, a high correlation setting, resetting, and reline position of its program calculation. Okay, now that's a cloud screen adaptation. The process calculation lines of manufacturing. All right, process lines of 1 is an X lines of 1 in 1 surface, 1 track, and 1 division. Of course, setting line calculation setting sets lines as set lines of communication lines, energetic ground screens, and set adaptations. Process lines of platform C, 6, 8, and 12, and 14, and set lines of laser track line provisions and cycles and track location. Demo equation. The center communication opens all signals, opens all panels into the line of modifications. Setting lines of travels. Now we go through line setting. 17 tractions, directing spots, lines, setting communication interference of travel. Spots, lines of indication of face recognition, time sequence. All levels of waving line screen, adaptation lines of server, position, location, initiate, run, line conditions, all levels, copy, paste, line conditions, all levels. I calculate, modify, and lines embedded in screen lines adaptation, execute 1 position pattern. Face represent time sequence, platform 1, platform 2, platform 3, platform 4, platform 5, set position. XD1000 comes in 1 tractions and 1 division. Okay, Set a core track interference of platform setting, one C line setting, one service, one traction, one division, one location, one service, one calculation. Okay. Range screens, direct screens, panel screens, solar lines, echo zero line, one charter wave, and communication of wave in lines of panels and line rotation. Traffic point lines of graph, sender communications over the signals. Get communication grounds, colors, panels. Let's go through blue tractions and direct signals. Modification lines of one surface, one traction, one division. Okay. Core track lines of 3 and 4 settings in set position. Platforms lines of grounds, we go into the 8 tracks. Now that's lines of ground communication centers in one service, one traction, one division, one location. Right? So you can use your tracker system any way and form, but you set up the arguer and line screens. Now go core track interference lines, 8 line setting, 8 positions, and 8 line rotation, surface attractions, all through frequencies. Direct lines of 3, 6, and 8 travel, and point lines of satellites. Now direct signals, modify the coloration lines of pattern, ground centers lines of 1, ground center lines of formation lines of 2, and teleportation screen lines of 3 as settings. Process calculation lines, ground centers, come into levels of red tracks. Red track line provisions of Pluto and line communication setting of our operation service and capsule communications lines of travel. Directing signals, modification lines of platform, back end line screen adaptations, process lines of 1, process lines of 2, process lines of 3, and travel. Calculate and modify hanger lines of 1, 2, platforms of docking 4, 6, and 8 travel communications. Directing settings lines of ground centers, center communication lines of A track, set lines of communication setting the surface. Direct calculus lines of platforms, cross-line signals, line rotation, laser track location, Skynet, and travel. Directing signal lines of solar flare, solar communication lines of set positional loads, operation surface, and position. 2 correlation setting and travels, right? Jupiter line, correlation lines of Neptune, right? Formation ground centers and line positional levels. Temperature readings in kaleidoscopes, communication ground centers and surface and traction. Okay, very complicated stuff. Confirmation line is a direct line symbol that all lines as communication setting or travel. Okay, so you have to recognize how to use your 12 foundation graph lines into your own binary chord center interferences, singularities, take it out of track provision lines of cycles, and you formulate as location equations. Let's add an equation screen. Lines of quantum screen, lines of equal, lines of E, lines of factor. Sets lines of A, B, C, D, and E, and F in formation. Okay. Ground centers, lines of quantum, lines of atmosphere, balance communication. See how I'm changing the communication lines, high center, compute line screen, direct division lines, echo screen lines, information lines of grounds. Okay. Communicating lines of wavings, set position travel, and 3-line communication lines of tether, and lines of earth line rotation surface, and set position calculation and direction. Directing lines of communication line highest interference of blip, and 3-line signals and 3-line communication setting of travel. Sets communication lines highest interference. E lines of travel, E lines of factor, cross line symbols. Process lines of 1 center, 1 surface, 1 traction, 1 division, 1 location. All through calculations, right? So all it is, guys, in line position location is just projection. Now you start to see things at higher line settings in the mind lines of collaboration. Center core line settings, 1 center, 1 surface, 15 lines of setting. Charge. Okay, so we got indicate lines of arrow indicating cross line signals, over cross line communications, cross line center interference of travel. Sets communication lines and alignments of 1 setting, 1 surface, 1 position. Platforms communication line, 1 surface, 1 traction, 1 location. Okay. Process lines indicates cross line signals and timestamp, time measure, and box location, X box. Cross line symbols and line rotation surface and track location. Okay. XT1000 comes in platform. XT28000 comes in platform communications. Process ground centers operate the service in the 4 platform and line rotation surface and track location. Directing symbolism, line cross line signals, 1 process, 1 center line setting a crop circle. Direct calculus lines and tubing and rotation surface and track location. All right. Directing lines is high center interference. Now you're in the center operation of surface, directing signals and line conditions and navigation, 3 course communication lines and navigation surface and traction. Direct calculus lines high center interference, platforms A, B, and C, and D, and travel. Done by equation. So the more you recognize your line screen adaptations to your system, your XT1000s, you understand how to use the A-track provision. Now, an A-track provision location is a subterranean line screen. Sets lines of high center interference. So correlate high center location lines. Travel point lines of graph, cross line signals. So we got 24 lines of measure, 12 outcast line communications, right? Outer rings, outer spectrum, outer division, outer line rotation, surface and tractions, right? Directing signals. 12 lines of 1, center core system, and travel in rotation, surface, and travel. Okay, cross lines of 2, cross lines of 1, and set position. Remember, I'm showing you guys to understand how to use your holographic lines of levels, your engineering skills, line communication, how to create the holographic settings into your cities through foundations. You got to get into core track provisions, how to use your letters, numbers, shapes, and symbols in line communication setting and measure and calculation. Because there's always going to be XT1000s platforms on standby in track location. All right. All right. Directing lines, your algorithm is a cross-line symbol. It all communicates to its system in settings, vectors, volume, line conditions, all levels, calculating high center interference. You can go in line communication lines of high center interference of settings, Xbox lines of 1, Xbox lines of 2, Xbox lines of 3. Doesn't look like Xbox is, but it is, right? Because it's all in center of operation of travel, endpoint lines of graph. Okay? 3 lines of indication, 2 lines of 1, 2 equals lines of 1, and position of 2 equals over lines of 1, and position of 1 traction, 1 division. Sets communications and ground centers in 1 surface, 1 traction, and XT1000 and travel. Okay? So your constant platforms of XT1000 are higher level setting now, guys, in 3 travels in position. Okay? X lines of 1, 3 lines across, time sequence, time panels, locking sequence on 4 box location of screen setting. Process location grid and line communications, point lines of graph, and center calculation, directing signals and process communications, right? Line signals in a half pipe, 3 line cycles in 1 center, 1 surface, 1 traction. Okay, symbolism lines of 1, set core lines and stargates. Stargate 1, Stargate 2, Stargate 3, 4, 6, and 8, and 12 and travel. Okay, open signals in platforms 1, platforms 2, platforms 3, platforms 4, 5, 6, and 7 in track location. Direct lines of indication lines across line signals, opposite inline calculation setting, location line grids, location grid line surface, and specification of frost bridge, line conditions at all levels of rainbow bridge, and travel in communications of processing. Directing signals into modifications, ground center lines of bridging. Now, this is where the team has to really start to identify everything inside position inside. You have to understand the inner core, which is the outer spectrum. You have to understand the inner line setting, which is your engineering skill sets. Again, in that communication setting, it's using 16/5, 5 provision cycles of 5 track locations, provision lines of cycles, 5 divisions, sets communication, right? Sets lines of 1 signal, operation lines of surface, 1 indicate line screen, 9 cross line symbols, and line track location. Now, it gets complicated once you send a 5 central system and travel, okay? Platforms, XT1000 to travel communication. All right, so it's really interesting when you set how to indicate that through a program. Your indication line screen is position lines of processing, indicate line settings of arrow indicating and process communication and ground centers. This is where humanity is in track location, right? Now, in that line screen, lines adaptation system and all lines communications. Now, clocking system of 0. This is where the team is in track locations and provision. No longer northwest, south, and east. There's center of nothing in communications, all lines of process communications. So you're out of this equations, no lines of 4 track provisions, all line sequence and all lines everywhere in traction. Humanity, team, okay? This position location centers of travels and point lines of communication in mind's eye, directing lines of the earth and line rotation surface and bridging. Process lines of the earth, center core systems and settings, okay? XT1000 here lines and signal lines and 4 panels of communication. Directing signal, right? Process lines of 1, process lines of 2, process lines of 6, and process lines of 12 in track location, right? Directing lines and aerodynamics into the navigation lines of your aviation system and travel. Sets communication lines, XT1000 lines in 1 set location. Okay? These are XT200s. Okay, these are all XT200s in set position. XT200. Okay. So we understand how this all works and our position locations, how to use an alter measure. Your communication ground centers understand how to use the configuration lines of phase direction time sequence that puts all communication setting and measure and scale communication to its balance and track locations. This sums up all lines of your panels and line screen adaptations in processing in communication system, all levels of you and track location. Okay, very powerful stuff. And this is all done through hardware and track line communication. This is basic. See, do you see how it skipped? You see it? It routed its routers and it changed its form. It went. Laser tractions, guys, and direct signals and modification ground centers. Magic comes in all ways and forms of travel. Okay, directing signals, right? So the more you formulate screen line adaptation to your settings of your earth, your air, your positions of all the relays, in your travels, in your home beacon lights and travel communications. Earth. Earth lines of 1, atmospheres lines of 2, relays of 3, travel lines of 4, and home beacon lines of 5. Calculation of the lines of 1 into 2 into 3 and 4 panels of communication. So now you have to understand how to break it down into singularities of EARTH. What does that mean to you through travel? Okay, center core systems of 1, 2, 3, 6, 8, 14, 20 lines and set positional lines of communication. Very powerful stuff in lines configuration of face recognition. Face recognition, guys. See it? Face recognition and set position. See? Woo, look at the face. Wow. Team is measuring a higher line screen lines adaptations of weather panels. So it's a lot more understandable when you understand how to use the platform that communicates and setting in travel communications. Because I'm telling you right now, all UFO line screen adaptations always on communication settings, right? Earth lines of 1, Earth lines of 2, Earth lines of 3, Earth lines of 4. Okay? So you have to understand what your Earth is now. It's its own modification of its own vessel. Your planets can move in its own system now because you're at the higher level setting. So modify the system and how to use it through the Earth line is the airline communication setting, how to use it through its reline line, how to use it through the travels and teleportation line, and communication, telegraphing, teleweaving, telecommunication interference into transformation. The telecommunication screen lines to your home beacon lights puts all capability modified 17 lines of travel, 5 lines of signals, clocking lines of 0 in one platform. That's a clock. That's a clock the team has to recognize now, right? Because you're at a 12 line provision, you're at a 24, you're at a 48, you're no longer in 144 track provision. Okay? Your center core system, your planets now are changing line set lines of screens now. Plasma screen holographic line setting, levels of communication in the foundation ground centers. How you can change the line communication setting in travel. So it's got all communication in your planetary service and line communication setting, all through rainbow screen lines adaptation. Okay? So it's a lot more complicated now because you're reaching higher level settings or algorithms. Binary reline communication setting to program. All through set position where you use letters, numbers, shapes, and symbols. But it's constantly changing line conditions, wind patterns, and travel communication. This is how you really understand how to communicate with the settings all through weather now. Right? Platforms of setting. Let's go through platform 1. 1 equals lines of 24. Let's start with that. Let's equals lines of 2 equals lines of 48. Now equals lines of frame. You have to add a frame to that, right? Because it's frames now. 24 lines of signal is a 12 line measure. 12 equals lines of 12. Sets position of 24 lines of measure, right? Court lines of high standards of flux, lines, screen lines, adaptations, right? Light over dark in travel. Cross line signals and cross line communications, right? Process line dimension, process line dimension, okay? Cross line symbols and line screen adaptation to process communication. X2000, see? Sets communication on the ground lines of 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 8 lines of travel. Directing symbolism, cross-line signals, and line communication setting programs in positional location of sonars and echo communication. Directing symbolism, lines of ground centers, lines of 1, platforms, lines equals lines of 2, 2 lines of 4, cross-line signals, 1 planet, cross lines of 2, track location, lines of provision, 24 cycles, line screen adaptation, energetic dome screen, adaptation lines of surface, sets communication and ground center interference of travel, endpoint lines of graph communication system, process lines of energetic dome screens of travel. Very complicated stuff, isn't it? All through equation, all through formula, all through line settings through hardware. This is all done through hardware. Now, you guys have your test that and high center interference. Now, getting in provision sets all communications set into your algorithms, how to set it, lines of sequence lines to your online communication setting to your iClouds and travel. Okay? So we got to center line communications, how to use the metric meters, lines of scales, and line communication all through pi. Center core line settings into your own aviation system and travel. Aviators, line screen adaptations, process lines of 1, process lines of 2, process lines of 6. So correlation setting, 1, 2, 3 lines of 8, 8 lines of 1, lines of 3, lines of 7, 6 lines of 1, 18 lines of 5. You can add equation lines of screen adaptations in a 40 line panel, in a 20 line, 6 lines of rotation surface and travel. So there's no time sequence, there's no time panel, there's no time at anything in travel. You got to become your own programmers of programming now. More than ever. The frequency panels is now in signal. We're at 19 lines of setting, gaps lines of 5 and track location, 5 lines of signals, 18 lines of mether, 17 lines of set, and 16 lines of settings, back in 19 lines of travel. Okay? So it's amazing how forward you are in graphing screen lines. It's going to like fast forward or lines of FYP or line condition setting or XYZ lines of high center interference or FYI. Getting that communication setting is interesting in how to use that through adaptations. Process lines of 15 lines of channels equals line 2 point lines of atoms. Coordinate high center location weight to 15 lines of track center interference, 5 line provision lines of cycles. Okay, where is that position lines of clocking? Nowhere. Nowhere. Okay. So you get a 5 central line setting. XC1000 comes in platform, right? Center core lines of high center interference platform 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5 set correlations. And a 5 cent settings. Sonar line, echo line, and 1 echo line, the rotation surface and travel. From 15 lines equals lines of 2 and 1, 5, and 1, 5 on location setting and process communication system. All right. The more lines of vision, the more track location your settings. Okay. 15 lines of travels into 50 in line position. So we have 50, 50 equals lines of travels and point lines of graph. Set correlation lines at 5 set position on standby, right? So where is that provision lines of time? Nowhere, right? 15 lines of channels, 15 lines of location, right? Indicates lines of flux and 3 travel communication. Process lines of platform, angle line rotation, surface, and travel. Direct symbolism, lines of 2, lines of 4, 6 location at travel. Directing signals, lines of 1 rotation, 1 center, 1 communication, the lines of colossal, and a planet surface, and over cross location is string line. Adaptation lines of surface, track location. So process lines, we go through lines of graph lines. Now again, the communication lines of high center interference, but it's all communication setting the ground. So we get a 20 line to measure, scale lines of rotation, lines surface, and travels. 3 lines of graph, and 4 lines of indication, 1 lines and 1 arrow. Process lines of platforms of pi, 3 track located lines, 2 over attractions, 0 over gravity. Okay, so this is how the XC1000 sees the platforms at 3 lines of communication. So you have lines of 1, 2, 3, and 4 lines of indication, lines of 5 and 6. You're going to see line position location of 6 lines of XC1000s on standby. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 position lines of travel. Directing signal lines to high center interference, 1 indication, 1 setting line rotation, 1 center line rotation laser grid, panel grid lines of solar flare, line rotation surface and tractions, set lines of Skynet line division location centers and travel communication. Okay, so the more you understand the skyline, the more it gets under provision. Okay, correlates and center relays, tracking interference location line settings. Process lines of 1 center and 1 umbrella. Directing signals, platform setting lines of 2 track location. Direct symbolism lines of ether, lines of firmament and track location. Calculate and modify plasma line seek, and center core system of the Earth and rotation surface interactions. Earth center, line rotation surface track calculation line settings into flight manifest and travel endpoint lines of communication. Earth and distant operation, right? Once the Earth travels line screen, it can travel anywhere it wants in platitude because it rotates its system and travel communications of flux. Flux lines of 1 and platforms of 3 lines. Earth line indicates lines of platform in lines high center interference, in point lines communication setting. But you have to go through Pluto in your own flight manifest and travel communications. Standard communications and ground centers lines of 1 center, 1 surface, 1 track location setting in Jupiter and set position. There's Jupiter. Very powerful stuff in travel. That my equation. Okay. So I'm just showing you what's going on when you guys reach higher level settings. Understanding how to process this and all of the sequence, all through face of recognition. See, face here, face here, face here. See the face? Look, right? Look at the face. Look at the beard. There's general. Boom. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy, right? Direction time sequence puts all lines of platitude, getting line communications, graph communications, studying the grounds. Powers lines, the atmosphere line screen locations, geometric force lines, communication lines. Your EMF lines, that's good flux over lines in 1. Sets communication lines of 2 channels and a 3 line provision. Okay. Battery reading lines into negative line into 1 position of 1 positive line screen. Calculates cross line signals into 1 system into 1 location grid and center. Process line and location lines in platitude line cell location system in 1 tether and 1 traction. Directing signal lines of particle acceleration line screen adaptations back again in travel of Jupiter. Jupiter rises line screen adaptation lines a surface that rotates the system and travel communication lines of 3 travels and point lines of graphs. Directing symbolism, 1 cross line screen lines adaptation, process lines of 0 and travel in point lines of graph communication. Point lines of graphs, center course system and line settings, process lines of platforms and travels, and 3 lines of graph communication setting of 0 gravity and rotation surface and travel. Very complicated stuff, but it's a lot of fun. So the planetary service now is set position and location your routers now, where you can actually change your planetary line screens. You can take them out of foundation grounds, but you can only copy and paste them. You can't take them out of their foundation ground centers. Process communication lines in the ground center line position location is 18 track provision. 1 center calculations, right? Cross lines of 1, cross lines of 2, cross lines of 4, cross lines of 8, cross lines of 6, and cross lines of 0 and travel. Points lines of 1 into planet 1, planet 2, planet 3, planet 6, planet 8, and planet 12 and travel. Okay? Cross line symbols encompass line position location system. Cross lines of platforms, settings, lines of 3 track lines, high center interference. Cross line signals, cross line communication lines in the 45 line setting. 4 over lines of 3. See? Sets communication lines of 3 over 6 over lines of 4 over 8. Sets communication lines of platforms, setting lines of travels, and point lines of communications. Directing indicate lines across line laser lines at 3 track provision molecule design line. Cross line signals, cross lines of 1, cross lines of 3, and atom line rotations, infusion over screen, photons, electrons, and neutrons, all through travel. Very, very complicated stuff, but it's a lot of fun, which is then how to put lasers together in travel. XT1000 concept platform, see what you've done. Cross-line symbols, online signal, online surface and track location system at center operation. Done by equation. Metric meters of scales change the ground centers, so with all sequence location of planets and surface. Now it's very powerful once you start how to direct and redirect location setting through your XT1000 lines of panels. Gets a high coordinate center interference laser direct signal location of plasma line screens, plasma line walls, and travel. Okay. XT1000 here in setting, process lines of 1, out through lines of 3, out lines of 6, and travel in point lines of graph. Sets communication of ground centers of platforms 1, 2, and 3 travels. Crossing line symbolism back in setting. Process lines of D track location, lines of provision, lines of cycles of track location. Calculate modify line setting, sun and the moon. Rotates the surface into 3-line provision, and it flux lines communication lines of channel of communication. Got my equation. If you look really close, you can see the intelligence sign line. See, here's the intelligence, platform communications and setting. Right, see, intelligence, platform. Process lines of ear travels, and rotation surface and travel. Points lines of symbolism, line conditions setting in track location. There's the intelligence. Boom! Okay? So it's a lot of fun when you just have fun. All through laser track location of Skynet. So you got the mechanism line screen. Let's go through laser lines of A line settings in 1 set position of B track. B track provision. I know it's complicated, guys, but you're going to have a lot of fun. B lines of A equals lines of 1. Okay. 1 indicates lines of A equals lines of D in set position. Okay. D indicates lines of 1, 3 dot line signals. 1, 2, and 3 travels and point lines of graph. Set core line centers is sonar, lines of 1, 2, and 3 lines of communication lines of graph. Sonar line indicates lines of Pluto, lines of Neptune, and Jupiter, and 3 lines in high center. Travel point lines of 1 in position 2 and 3 track location. Directing symbolism, 1 XT1000, XT1000, XT200, XT100, XT0, and travel. Set ground centers, lines of 1 lines of B track, 1 provision, A lines of setting, A lines of surface, A lines of setting, A lines of setting, A lines of surface, A lines of surface, A lines of rotational line communication setting, a process of pi in track location. This is all done through location grid line, okay, in your Skynet. All right. Getting communication ground centers is a laser track provision lines. It sets all communication setting, how you get into the routes and the routers and line communication spectrum in position. Okay. So once you get into the routes and the routers, the line signal location to your moon line comes in track provision. That's 18 cycles, lines of the moon. Okay, that's the moon, right? Sets lines of moon and line rotation surface and track location of 3-line cycle. There's the moon, right? Center core system and a cross line settings and figure 8 line rotation. Cross line signals, center core system, flux lines, and atom line rotation, circulation, rotation, surface attraction. 18 lines of measure, platforms of 1, and position of settings, and platforms of 3 set correlations. Platforms are two set location line settings and platform communication. Okay, directing signals, right? So the more you come into hardline screen, the more you use your oversouls or your avatars. You have to understand how to use the metric meters, how to use the scales, the balance, how to use your electrical screen lines adaptations, how to process this in all line signals. What is the modification of screen lines, adaptation lines, of surface set correlation setting in position towards operation surface? What are we in track provision lines and high center interference, high position calculations, directing lines and modification lines, screen lines, adaptations? Getting into the position, we're at 19.5, right? 19.5. I told you. See? 19.5. 18. See? 19.5, 18.5. So it's constantly existing and setting. So you're not missing out through channel. You're not missing out through operation. You're not missing out through division. But your correlation setting is constantly changing the existence of the existing and all lines of panels, putting lines at 18 lines of attractions back to 19 in line communications and setting into 17 or 16, right? It's a formation ground centers that you have to recognize how to use the existing and all levels of channel operations in all communications of zero gravity and set within 100% in mind centers of conception. Hoo-ah, down by equation. Yeah. So it's an ongoing conversation in the existing of all position. What are we in track lines of high center interference? What did I say we're coming into position of? 19, 18, we're at 17.5. We're at 17.5. So are we in chronological order of existing? Yes. We start off 19, we go through 18, we go through 17. But always in 5, that doesn't change channel. So I have a complete cycle and a complete system and all levels of conscious location and awareness communicating with the channel operation of its existing, not its existence. Understanding the dimensional sail and the solar sail of travel, 100% of the mind and 0% of gravity in your vessel of communication. All done through equation. Okay? All right. So there's a lot being said in line communication settings of graphs, right? So you have to start using their time frame and turn it into schematics now. That's what the team has to come in provision of. Okay, so to have a conversation with your computer in time frame, you have to understand the correlations of its frame itself, which is its foundation of its nothing of itself. Self-modification, self-development, self-preservation. Gets all communication how to really get in calculations to use those telepathy signals in telekinesis line screen. Observation, scanning, influence, intent, and manipulation. All of the line communication that travels puts everything in all communication setting in all lines of communication lines of balance and track location. Okay. So it's amazing how it's set in signals, right? 17.5. But it's having an ongoing conversation with anybody, okay, in the existing, not the existence. You know your existence, but you have to understand what governs you now in short and longevity. Now, this is understanding the process, how you come into that provision. Through all levels of what you come into is all levels of attraction. Nothing of chasing in any way and form. Okay? It's about you coming into attractions of everything that you see through provision. I set lines of communication spectrum, or the center communication lines that put all lines of communications back into balance. But it's amazing how we go from line screens of 19, 18, and 17 track locations to 5 provision. Amazing stuff, isn't it? At 100% of zero gravity in the vessel of communications, right? All right, so it's amazing how we come to laser attractions and direct signals. And it's amazing how we come to the equation lines, the screen lines, adaptation lines, of setting. All lines of communication set interference. Setting that formation location. So it's about listening to computer and that formation lines of grounds. Operation server location setting and planetary surface and track location. Okay? Directing lines of all communication setting and ground communication to a system as surface. And all lines of calculation how to surface that and all lines of wind factors and communication lines configuration of face recognition. Okay? Everything is digital, guys. Everything is computerized. So once we understand how to direct and redirect our panels, then we understand how to process that and all lines of communication lines of platforms in clouds of screen lines, adaptation lines of center communication. All right? Anything that you do is a formation lines of graph and platforms communication to a setting. Okay. Now, what are we back in tractions of and setting? Back to 19.5. See? So it went from 17.5. Now we're changing the travels into a new frame, 19.5, right? Now it's into 18.5. See? Now it's on its own system. See how I control its system, but I need confirmation. Basically understand where it's coming from, its own provision of its own foundation, of its own graph, which is own nothing, which you have to come in position that governs its own system, of its own operation, of its own intelligence. So it's on its own now. It's going from its 19, 18, it does whatever it wants to do. So it can go from 17, 16, 15, it can do whatever it wants because it's in its own system, that when its own line setting of its existing in position location, because already in its existence and travel, but it's on its own system now, right? Which means I have no core track provision, which means I'm not communicating with it anymore. It's on its own system, of its own space, of its own modulation setting, in its dimensional and solar sail and track location. But it's always in 100% in set lines in the mind of conception. Zero gravity, zero formations of Papa of uniform. Okay? Very powerful stuff. All right? All right. So I need to get everybody out of frame lines and space line and time frame. I need you guys to get your schematics, how you see lines of 1, 0, 5, lines of 4 of 4, or lines of 18, lines of volume, and position lines of travel. There's not one indicated system that I set position of space and through time. Getting in communication is a ground centers, okay? Processing this puts all lines of all communication lines of balance. See, it's in its own frame of 19.5, but it's constantly listening to me. It's constantly listening to you. So you're in control, but you have to understand they're also in control. So whatever governing everything that you come into position of is the existing of changing frame. You've got to get into that through your own prodigal system, a prodigy. Your position or your brilliance in position location, your system puts all levels of you into line communications, into your immortalities and track communication setting at 100% of all line of existing in the existence of all provision. Okay, and zero gravity and vessel of communication. Okay, all done through equation. All right. All right. So hopefully you guys get a better understanding how to use that throughout provision location in your settings and formulate equations. You understand how to direct and redirect your panels and how to calculate and modify. But everything around you is constantly listening to you, right? But there's a reason why everything governs its own system that's in your provision locations, because you got in through its own lines of attraction. Your body is nothing but an attraction to everything around you that you already have. It's an alteration that you cannot change. The only thing you can change is how you see the past, present, and future through a simulator. Not through your simulation. Your simulation is out of creation coming into creating. Okay, in all lines of communication. But you've got to be in position location, all line signals in existence at 100% in the mind system. And zero gravity is that calculation. Okay, all through framing. Okay. All right, that's it. We're done. Very powerful class, guys, all through track location laser. It's amazing how we come in information lines of grounds and that all communication system all through travel. Okay. Get you guys all ready in line symbolism, line screen lines, adaptations, and process of platforms in line communication, iClouds, eClouds, formation clouds, line calculus setting, manufacturing clouds, communication clouds, all direct signals and symbolism, letters, numbers, shape, and symbols, and platforms of communication lines of laser graph communication setting to travel. Gets all communication to your system and position lines of set correlations. Now, what is it in lines of calculations, high center interference? What is it in position of the back in the frame communication setting? What is my computer in a position location and system? It's now changed to what? 18.6. It's on its own operation of its own system, but it's constantly listening to me. It's constantly listening to me and records everything you say and do. Now it's back at 19. Went from 18, now it's at 19. But the volume has changed because it's at 6, no longer at 5. Okay, it's 19 over 6 now. But it's on its own system of its own space, of its own time, that governs its own system, of its own operation, of its own intelligence. Okay? 19 of 6 line position, right? So it's on its own formations, which is amazing in track applications. Center calculation lines of high center interference. Placebo cortex line division lines of high center interference locations. Physical cortex, invisible lines of charts, clocking system of compass, striking signals, dimensional door screens, adaptation, Process calculates lines of theta, operates line set locations of commander 6. Flux lines calculates the lines of Stargate portal. Line conditions of uniform and towers of communications settings. All ground levels, level C, and line position locations. Now we're at track provisions lines of 20 over 6 over lines over pi. It's all done through equation, right? It's on its own system and track locations. But it's constantly listening to you until you understand how to modify your syst and the vessel at zero gravity in set position. See you in 5.